The sound of splintering wood echoed across the Arizona desert as Thomas McBride brought his sledgehammer down on the charred beam for what he swore would be the last time. The morning sun was already merciless at 7 o'clock, promising another day of the crushing heat that had plagued his ranch for weeks. Sweat poured down his weathered face as he paused, wiping his brow with a sleeve that had long since given up any pretense of cleanliness. The old barn had stood like a blackened skeleton on his property for 10 years now, a constant reminder of the night that had taken everything from him. Today, finally, he was tearing it down. His hired hand, Miguel Santos, worked beside him with the methodical patience of a man who had learned not to ask too many questions. The Mexican laborer had arrived at dawn with 2 other men Thomas barely knew, their names lost in the blur of faces that had passed through his ranch over the years. What mattered was that they worked hard and didn't pry into his business. Miguel's crowbar caught under a particularly stubborn piece of flooring, and with a grunt of effort, he pried it loose. The board came up with a sickening crack that seemed to reverberate far longer than it should have. In the sudden silence that followed, all 4 men froze. Beneath where the floorboard had been, instead of the packed earth and ash they expected, was a gaping hole. The darkness below seemed to swallow the morning light, and a smell rose from the opening that made Thomas's stomach lurch. It wasn't the smell of old fire or decay. It was something else entirely. Something alive. Miguel crossed himself quickly and stepped back from the hole, his dark eyes wide with fear. The other 2 workers exchanged glances and began backing toward their horses, but Thomas found himself drawn forward against every instinct screaming at him to run. He had lived on this land for 15 years. He knew every inch of it, every stone and gully and hidden spring. There had never been any kind of cellar or cave beneath this barn. The ground here was hard caliche clay that would have taken months to excave by hand. Dropping to his knees at the edge of the opening, Thomas peered into the darkness. His eyes, accustomed to the blazing Arizona sun, took long moments to adjust. Gradually, shapes began to emerge from the shadows below. Rough wooden planks formed makeshift walls. Empty tin cans scattered across a dirt floor. And in the far corner, barely visible in the dim light filtering down from above, something that made his blood turn to ice in his veins. It was a person. A woman. Sitting with her back against the earthen wall, knees drawn up to her chest, long hair falling like a curtain across her face. She was so still that for a moment Thomas convinced himself she was dead, had to be dead, some poor soul who had taken shelter here during the fire and been forgotten. But then, impossibly, she raised her head. The face that looked up at him through the gloom was gaunt and pale, aged beyond its years by hardship and darkness. But the eyes, those green eyes that had haunted his dreams for a decade, were unmistakably hers. Thomas McBride found himself staring into the face of his wife, Sarah, whom he had buried in the Tucson cemetery 10 years ago. The scream that tore from his throat brought Miguel running back to the hole, and what the Mexican saw there would plague his sleep for years to come. Thomas had collapsed at the edge of the opening, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. Below in the makeshift chamber, the woman they would later identify as Sarah McBride sat motionless, her eyes fixed on something in the distance that none of them could see. Miguel knew enough English to understand Thomas's broken words between the sobs. Wife. Dead. 10 years. Impossible. The laborer had heard stories about the fire, of course. Everyone in the territory knew about the tragedy that had befallen the McBride ranch. How Sarah had been trapped in the barn during a storm, how Thomas had tried desperately to reach her through the flames, how they had found nothing but bones and ashes when the fire finally burned itself out. The entire community had mourned with Thomas. The preacher had spoken beautiful words over an empty coffin. But here she was, alive, breathing, staring up at them from a hidden chamber that shouldn't exist beneath a barn that had burned to the ground a decade ago. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the surreal scene. Dr. William Hayes had been making his monthly rounds to the outlying ranches, his medical bag bouncing against his horse's flank as he rode up the dusty path to the McBride place. He had expected to find Thomas working on his usual repairs and improvements. Instead, he found a scene that defied every rational explanation his scientific mind could conjure. Thomas was still on his knees at the edge of the hole, his face streaked with tears and dust, muttering his wife's name over and over like a prayer or a curse. Miguel stood nearby, hat in his hands, speaking rapid Spanish in what sounded like a combination of prayers and profanity. The other two workers had mounted their horses and were riding hard toward town, apparently deciding that whatever was happening at the McBride Ranch was well beyond what they had signed up for. Dr. Hayes dismounted slowly, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. As the only medical man within 50 miles, he had been called to examine more than his share of impossible situations. He had delivered babies who shouldn't have survived, treated gunshot wounds that should have been fatal, and pronounced men dead who had somehow managed to keep breathing. But this was something entirely different. Approaching the hole cautiously, Hayes peered into the chamber below. The woman sat exactly as Thomas and Miguel had found her, motionless and silent. Her clothes, what remained of them, were little more than rags. Her hair, once the pride of the county social gatherings, hung in matted tangles around her shoulders. But it was definitely Sarah McBride. Hayes had delivered both of her children, had treated her for everything from influenza to a broken wrist from a fall off her horse. He knew that face as well as he knew his own. Impossible as it seemed, Sarah McBride was alive. The implications crashed over Hayes like a physical blow. If Sarah was alive, then whose bones had they found in the barn? If she had been living in this underground chamber for 10 years, who had been caring for her? How had she survived? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if Thomas had truly believed his wife was dead, why did he look more terrified than relieved to see her alive? Hayes forced his voice to remain calm and professional as he called down to Sarah. She showed no reaction to his words, no sign that she even heard him. Her eyes remained fixed on that distant point, as if she were seeing something far beyond the confines of her earthen prison. When Hayes tried again, speaking her name gently, she finally moved. Her head turned slowly toward the sound, and for a brief moment, her eyes met his. What Hayes saw in those eyes would stay with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't madness, though that might have been easier to understand. It was awareness. Complete, terrible awareness of exactly where she was and how long she had been there. Sarah McBride wasn't lost in some merciful delusion or protective madness. She knew exactly what had happened to her. The sound of more approaching riders echoed across the desert. Word traveled fast in the sparse communities of the Arizona Territory, and the sight of two terrified workers racing toward town at full gallop had been enough to bring out half the settlement. Marshal James Sullivan rode at the head of a group that included the local preacher, the telegraph operator, and several ranchers from neighboring spreads. They arrived to find Hayes carefully climbing down into the chamber with a rope, his medical bag slung across his shoulder. Thomas had finally stopped his sobbing and sat in the dust beside the hole, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Miguel remained nearby, clearly torn between his desire to flee and his sense of loyalty to his employer. The approaching crowd reined in their horses at a respectful distance, but Sullivan dismounted and walked directly to the opening. The marshal had been a lawman for over 20 years, first in Kansas and now in Arizona Territory. He had seen murders and robberies, claim jumpers and cattle rustlers, drunken shootouts and family feuds that ended in blood. He prided himself on being a man who could look at any situation and quickly separate fact from speculation, evidence from hysteria. But as he stared down into the chamber where Dr. Hayes was gently examining a woman who was supposed to have died a decade ago, Sullivan felt the foundations of his professional certainty begin to crack. Hayes's voice drifted up from below, professional and measured despite the circumstances. Sarah was alive and breathing normally. She appeared to be suffering from severe malnutrition and what he suspected was a form of mental shock. She had responded to his touch by allowing him to check her pulse and examine her eyes, but she had not spoken a word. Most disturbing were the marks on her wrists and ankles, old scars that suggested she had been restrained for extended periods. The implications of that observation sent a chill through every man present. If Sarah had been held prisoner in this chamber, then someone had been keeping her here. Someone had been feeding her, bringing her water, maintaining this elaborate deception for 10 years. Someone who knew she was here while the entire community mourned her death. Sullivan's eyes moved slowly from the hole to Thomas, who sat motionless in the dust. The rancher's behavior was troubling. A man who had just discovered his beloved wife alive after 10 years of grief should be overcome with joy, relief, desperate urgency to help her. Instead, Thomas seemed almost catatonic with shock. Or was it fear? As Hayes carefully lifted Sarah from the chamber with the help of Miguel and the rope, the assembled crowd got their first clear look at the woman who had become a legend in their community. The tragic tale of Sarah McBride's death had been told and retold around countless campfires and dinner tables. She had become a symbol of the harsh realities of frontier life, the beautiful young wife lost to the unforgiving land. Seeing her now, gaunt and aged but undeniably alive, seemed to tear at the very fabric of their shared history. Sarah made no sound as Hayes wrapped her in his coat and carried her toward his wagon. Her eyes remained fixed on that invisible distant point, and she showed no recognition of any of the faces surrounding her. When the doctor placed her gently in the back of his wagon, she curled into the same position she had maintained in the chamber, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around herself like armor against the world. Sullivan approached Thomas, who had finally risen to his feet but remained silent and still. The marshal's voice was carefully neutral as he asked the questions that had to be asked. When had Thomas last been in the barn? Who else knew about the chamber below? How long had he been planning to tear down the structure? Thomas's answers came slowly, as if each word had to be dragged from somewhere deep inside him. He claimed he had avoided the barn since the fire, unable to bear the memories it contained. He insisted he had never known about any chamber or hiding place beneath the floor. He said he had decided to tear it down only recently, tired of looking at the reminder of his loss every day. But there was something in his voice, some quality that made Sullivan's instincts prickle with suspicion. As Dr. Hayes prepared to transport Sarah to his clinic in town, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of taking her directly to his office, he would stop first at the marshal's office. Something about this situation demanded official investigation, and Hayes suspected that Sarah McBride's return from the dead was only the beginning of a much larger and more disturbing truth. The wagon rolled away across the desert, carrying its silent passenger toward a town that believed it had already said goodbye to her. Behind them, Sullivan remained with Thomas and the growing crowd of onlookers, all of whom were beginning to ask the same impossible questions. In the harsh light of the Arizona sun, the burned skeleton of the barn cast long shadows across the ground, and in those shadows, the truth waited to be uncovered. As the afternoon heat began to build toward its daily crescendo, Marshal Sullivan found himself staring into the empty chamber where Sarah McBride had spent 10 years of her life. The walls showed signs of habitation that went far beyond mere survival. Scratches in the dirt that might have been an attempt to mark the passage of time. Worn spots on the earthen floor that suggested regular movement along specific paths. And most disturbing of all, what appeared to be the remains of a crude lock mechanism on what had once been a wooden door at the chamber's entrance. Sarah McBride hadn't been hiding in this underground room. She had been imprisoned here. And somewhere in the Arizona territory, the person responsible for that imprisonment was still free, still breathing, still walking among the very people who had mourned his victim's supposed death. The sun climbed higher, and the desert began its familiar dance with heat and shadow. But for the first time in 10 years, the mystery of what had really happened in Thomas McBride's barn was about to be solved. And Marshal Sullivan had a growing suspicion that the truth, when it finally emerged, would be far more terrible than anyone in their small community could possibly imagine. The marshal's office in Tucson had never felt smaller than it did that evening as Marshal Sullivan sat across from Thomas McBride, the oil lamp between them casting dancing shadows on the adobe walls. Outside, the desert wind whistled through the streets, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day to come. Thomas had not spoken since they had ridden into town 3 hours earlier, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had turned white. Dr. Hayes emerged from the back room where Sarah lay on a narrow cot, his face grim with the weight of what he had discovered during his examination. The physical evidence painted a picture that made Sullivan's jaw clench with barely controlled rage. Sarah bore the scars of a decade of captivity. Rope burns on her wrists and ankles that had healed and been reopened countless times. Malnutrition that had stunted her growth and left her bones brittle as dried corn stalks. But most telling of all were the recent calluses on her hands, marks that could only have come from digging, clawing at earth and stone with desperate persistence. When Hayes spoke, His voice carried the controlled fury of a man who had sworn an oath to heal and had instead found evidence of systematic cruelty. Sarah had not been merely imprisoned in that underground chamber. She had been buried alive, given just enough food and water to survive, kept like an animal in conditions that would have driven most people to madness. The fact that she had retained her sanity, that she had somehow endured 10 years of such treatment, spoke to a strength of spirit that humbled both men. Sullivan leaned forward in his chair, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. The questions came slowly, methodically, each one designed to strip away another layer of the lie that had sustained itself for a decade. When had Thomas really last seen his wife alive? Why had he been so quick to accept that her body had been completely consumed in the fire? Who else had access to his property during the years following the supposed tragedy? Thomas's answers came in fragments, contradictions that revealed themselves like cracks in a dam under pressure. He claimed Sarah had been visiting her sister in Phoenix when the fire occurred. But there was no sister in Phoenix. He insisted the fire had been caused by lightning during a summer storm. But the summer of 1877 had been one of the driest on record. He swore he had searched every inch of the barn's remains for any trace of his beloved wife. But the chamber where she had been found was directly beneath the area he claimed to have excavated most thoroughly. The truth, when it finally began to emerge, was as ugly as the desert landscape in the harsh light of noon. Sarah had discovered something about Thomas's business dealings that he could not allow her to reveal. She had learned about the stolen cattle he had been running through his ranch, the bribes he had paid to territorial officials, the murders he had committed to protect his growing empire of corruption. When she had threatened to expose him, he had made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The fire had been deliberately set, but not to kill Sarah. It had been staged to provide cover for her disappearance. While the community mourned the tragic loss of the rancher's beautiful wife, Sarah had been imprisoned beneath the very barn where everyone believed she had died. The bones they had found and buried with such ceremony had belonged to a drifter Thomas had killed weeks earlier, a man whose disappearance would never be investigated or mourned. For 10 years, Thomas had maintained the charade. He had played the role of the grieving widower, accepting condolences and sympathy while keeping his wife locked in a chamber barely large enough for a grown person to stand upright. He had fed her scraps like a dog, provided her with just enough water to survive, and told himself that he was being merciful by not simply killing her outright. But Sarah had never stopped fighting. Even in the depths of her earthen prison, she had continued to dig, to claw at the walls and floor with her bare hands, searching for any weakness that might lead to freedom. The chamber Sullivan had found was larger than the one Thomas had originally constructed. Sarah had expanded it herself, inch by painful inch, over the course of years. She had been trying to tunnel her way to freedom when Thomas's demolition had finally exposed her to the light. As the full scope of Thomas's crimes became clear, Sullivan felt a rage building inside him that threatened to overwhelm his professional discipline. This was not just murder or kidnapping. This was a form of torture so prolonged and calculated that it defied comprehension. Thomas had not simply taken Sarah's life. He had stolen 10 years of it, day by day, hour by hour, keeping her alive only to prolong her suffering. The confession, when it finally came, was delivered in a voice so flat and emotionless that it seemed to come from a man already dead. Thomas admitted to every detail, from the staged fire to the years of imprisonment to the casual cruelty with which he had treated his captive wife. He showed no remorse, no recognition of the magnitude of his crimes. To him, Sarah had been nothing more than a problem to be managed, a threat to be neutralized, a possession to be stored away until it was no longer inconvenient. When Marshal Sullivan placed the iron shackles around Thomas's wrists, the sound echoed through the small office like the closing of a tomb. Justice in the Arizona Territory was swift and certain for crimes of this magnitude. Thomas McBride would hang before the month was out, and his death would be witnessed by every person in the county who had been deceived by his decade-long performance of grief. But for Sarah, the end of her captivity was only the beginning of a different kind of struggle. Dr. Hayes had arranged for her to be taken to a women's sanctuary in San Francisco, where she could receive the care and support she would need to rebuild a life that had been stolen from her. The woman who had entered that underground chamber in 1877 was gone forever, destroyed by years of unimaginable hardship. The woman who emerged was someone else entirely, forged by suffering into something harder and more resilient than the frontier wife she had once been. As the wagon carrying Sarah disappeared into the desert morning, heading toward a railroad that would take her to a new life, Marshall Sullivan stood outside his office and watched the sun rise over the mountains. The mystery of the McBride Ranch had been solved, but the questions it raised about the nature of evil and endurance would linger in the small community for generations to come. In the harsh landscape of the Arizona Territory, where survival itself was an act of daily courage, Sarah McBride had survived the unsurvivable and emerged into the light with her humanity intact. The burned skeleton of the barn would be torn down completely within the week, and the underground chamber filled with earth and stone until no trace of it remained. But the story of what had happened there would live on, passed down from one generation to the next as a reminder that even in the darkest places, the human spirit could endure and ultimately triumph over the cruelest intentions of those who sought to destroy it.